They came out of the dark without warning, killed everything that needed killing, and went back into the dark without a word of explanation. No survivors among their enemies, no records left behind, no answers given to the Imperium they supposedly serve. The Carcharodons Astra, the space sharks, are the most secretive chapter in the galaxy, and the official line is that they're just a fleet-based space marine chapter of unknown founding who've been out of contact so long they've gone a little strange. Unknown founding. Read that again. In a galaxy where the Imperium documents the gene lineage of every chapter back to its parent legion, here is one whose origin is a blank. They use cryostasis no other chapter uses. Their gene seed behaves in ways the Adeptus Mechanicus files under "Do Not Investigate." They are pale, enormous, and older than they should be.
And there is exactly one explanation that makes every one of those anomalies stop being a coincidence. The Carcharodons are not a lost chapter. They are a lost legion. The second. Now, before we go one sentence further, hear the honest version of what we're doing, because the audience for this channel will hold me to it. That hook is not a Games Workshop ruling. It is a theory. The Carcharodon's founding is genuinely, deliberately unconfirmed in canon, and the strongest piece of official origin evidence actually points somewhere else entirely. We will get to that. We will put the countercase in front of you with both hands, because the version of this argument that hides the countercase isn't worth your 40 minutes. We're not re-arguing whether the space sharks are strange. The record is not in dispute on that point. We're asking a narrower, colder question. What kind of strange?
The kind that comes from a chapter drifting too long in the deep, or the kind that comes from a redaction. And the word Carcharodons, say it with me, Carcharodons, the Great White's own genus, is going to keep meaning the thing the records won't explain for the next half hour. So let's start with the things the records do say. Start with the anomaly stack, because every one of these is in the source material, and every one of them is a problem. The primary canonical text on this chapter is Imperial Armour Volume 10, the Forge World book on the second half of the Badab War, published in 2011. Open it to the Carcharodons, and the very first thing it does is refuse to tell you where they came from. The chapter is, in the book's own framing, of unknown founding, alleged to be either an ancient chapter born as early as the second founding, or a relatively new one raised during the 23rd. That is not a small range.
That is the difference between 10,000 years old and a few centuries old, and the most detailed source book in the setting cannot or will not close it. Then there's where they live. The Carcharodons do not have a home world you can point to on the standard charts. They are a fleet-based chapter, perpetually underway, and the canon says they have been roaming the void for 10 standard millennia, cut off from all contact with the wider Imperium, their existence having long since fallen from recorded history. Sit with that phrasing. Fallen from recorded history. Not never recorded, fallen out of it. Something that was once written down and then wasn't. Watch how they actually enter the story, because the manner of their arrival is itself a data point. The reason we know anything about the Carcharodons at all is the Badab War, the secession campaign in the Maelstrom Zone that Imperial Armour Volume 10 documents in forensic detail.
And in the year 910 of the 41st millennium, with no warning and no announcement, a Carcharodon's fleet simply materialized at the edge of the Golgothan wastes, led by their battle barge, the Nicor, a heavily modified Charybdis-class Grand Cruiser old enough to have sailed in the Great Crusade. The book records that their sudden appearance caused considerable alarm on both sides of the conflict simultaneously. Read that carefully. Both sides.
Neither the Loyalist enforcers nor the secessionists had this chapter on file. Neither could say who they were or whose authority they answered to. An entire fleet of Space Marines arrives in the middle of an Imperial war, and the most detailed records the Imperium can produce on either side amount to a shrug. That is not how the Imperium relates to its own chapters. That is how the Imperium relates to a ghost. Then there's how they look. Pale to the point of corpse white, liquid black eyes with no visible whites.
And big, unusually large even by the standard of the Adeptus Astartes, who are already 8 feet of engineered giant. Their chapter master Tyberos is so far over the line that the hobby press flatly calls him the biggest space marine in the setting. And then there's the cold detail, the one a viewer named Philip Monroe put his finger on in the comments, the one that has 89 people nodding along. The Carcharodons sleep in ice. They use cryostasis. We'll spend a long beat on exactly what that means and exactly what it doesn't, because it's the single most quoted piece of evidence for the theory and also the single most overstated. But for now, just log it. Unknown founding. Fleet bound for 10,000 years. Corpse pale, oversized, and they put their warriors in coffins between fights. Here is the promise. Every one of those is normally served to you as flavor, as the spooky texture of a spooky chapter. I'm going to argue that they're not flavor. They're data points. And there is one reading under which all of them stop being coincidences at the same moment. So let's test it, piece by piece, and let's start with the one that should be impossible, the unknown founding. Think about the system it sits inside. The Imperium of Man is, among other things, the largest bureaucracy that has ever existed or ever will. It records the gene lineage of every Space Marine chapter back to its parent legion. The successor chapters of the Ultramarines are catalogued. The successors of the Imperial Fists are catalogued. When a new chapter is founded, its gene seed is drawn from a known source, logged, certified, and filed. The whole point of the system, the reason it exists, is that the Imperium does not trust its own super soldiers and wants a paper trail on every last one of them back to a Primarch. In that system, we don't know where this chapter came from is not a blank space. It is an anomaly the size of a legion.
And here's where the canon contradicts itself in a way worth slowing down on. 2 facts, both official, that cannot comfortably both be true. Fact 1. The Imperium documents chapter lineage obsessively. Fact 2. This chapter's lineage is unknown, a true blank, in a system designed to make blanks impossible, is not an oversight. An oversight is a missing footnote. This is a missing father. And in this universe, there is a specific, named, canonical mechanism for producing exactly that kind of blank on purpose. It's called the Edict of Obliteration. Here's what the canon refuses to print plainly, so let me print it. An Edict of Obliteration, in High Gothic, a damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, is the Imperium's formal procedure for deliberately destroying every record, every icon, every monument, every mention of a person or an organization it has declared anathema, not defeating them, deleting them, making it so that future generations cannot prove they ever existed. And the canon tells you, in plain text, that the most successful Edict of Obliteration ever carried out in the whole of Imperial history was performed on 2 of the original Space Marine legions, the 2nd and the 11th. Their names removed, their deeds removed, their Primarchs removed so completely that 10,000 years later, the most powerful intelligences in the galaxy cannot agree they ever drew breath. And notice the timing the canon does give you for those two erased legions, because it's a detail the failure story conveniently skips. The 2nd and the 11th were not idle. The records that survive place both of them in the Rangdan Genocides, the war against the Rangdan in the 860s of the 31st millennium, a Xenos campaign so catastrophic that the Imperium's own histories say the losses were not exceeded until the dark days of the Horus heresy itself. So the last thing the record knows about the Second Legion is that it was thrown against the single worst threat humanity had faced to that point, and bled white doing it. That is not the profile of a legion that embarrassed itself on a parade ground. That is the profile of a legion spent on a job too dangerous to talk about. Hold that thought. It comes back. So now lay the two things side by side. The Imperium has a documented, named, used capability for erasing a legion down to the studs, and it has a chapter sitting at the edge of the map whose origin is a documented blank. The theory does not need to invent a mechanism. The mechanism is canon. The only question, and it is a real question, not a settled one, is whether this particular blank is one of those particular erasures.
And this is where the record contradicts itself a second time, because the same source book that gives you the suggestive blank also gives you a competing answer. And intellectual honesty means we put it on the table now, not at the end where it can't hurt the argument. Here is the countercase, stated as strongly as I can state it. The dominant canonical lean on the Carcharodons is not Lost Legion, it is Raven Guard. The book calls them an alleged successor chapter of the Raven Guard, though it carefully adds that this remains unconfirmed. Their gene seed exhibits features similar to the Raven Guards. The same pallor runs in that line. When Carcharodons have fallen serving in the Death Watch, and their gene seed has been analyzed by Death Watch apothecaries, it has been recorded as bearing certain genetic markers unique to the Raven Guard. And the strongest single thread of all, the Carcharodon's chapter master carries the title Shade Lord, and that exact title is known to have been used by precisely one figure in the whole of recorded history. An exiled Raven Guard commander named Arcas Fall during the Great Crusade. That is not nothing. That is a name, a legion, and a chain of custody. A viewer called Bubba Gunshrimp said it cleanly, and 192 people agreed. Tyberos not being a Primarch is better. The cohort is right to be suspicious of the romantic answer. So am I. Hold both in your head. A documented blank that the edict of obliteration would explain, and a documented Raven Guard thread that would explain it differently. The space sharks are genuinely contested, and a video that tells you otherwise has stopped reading the record and started writing fan fiction. Now, with that honesty banked, let's go to the piece of evidence that made Philip Monroe's comment the spine of this whole video. The ice. The Carcharodons use cryostasis, and they use it in a way no ordinary chapter does. When they travel the void, which is to say, almost always, most of the chapter's void brothers sleep in individual cryo tanks. The canon is specific about the biology of it. The suspended hibernation is enabled by an Astartes implant called the Sus-Ann membrane, the organ that lets a space marine drop into a death-like sleep and survive it. The book says it is the younger brethren and the initiates who use the tanks the most, overcoming the deep void sickness of the endless dark through the meditative stillness the membrane allows. So picture the chapter not as a fleet of awake warriors, but as a fleet of coffins, most of them occupied, drifting between the stars for centuries at a stretch. And here is where I have to be the most careful, because this is the most speculative link in the entire chain, and the audience for this channel will know it the instant I overstep.
The cautious reading, the one the canon actually supports,
is that the cryotanks are rest. Routine, biological, between-deployment rest. The way a long-haul ship runs a skeleton crew and lets the rest sleep. That is what the source says, and I'm not going to pretend it says more. But here's what's strange, and it's strange even under the cautious reading. Of all the hundreds of chapters in the Imperium, why is this the one built around the coffin? Why is this the one whose entire culture, whose entire rhythm of existence is sleep, wake, fight, sleep again, for 10,000 years? The Suzan membrane exists in every Astartes. Only these warriors made it the center of who they are. And if you wanted to keep something intact across 10,000 years at the edge of the map, something you could neither integrate into the wider Imperium nor bring yourself to be rid of, the kind of practice that could, in theory, do it is exactly this one. Not a metaphor, a mechanism.
A warrior in true suspension does not age the way a waking one does. A line kept mostly asleep does not drift, does not reform, does not get re-educated by 10,000 years of imperial schooling into forgetting what it was. The canon does not say the Carcharodons are a legion on ice. I want to be exact. It does not say that. What it says is that they are the one chapter for whom being on ice is the whole identity. And the theory simply asks, why? The honest answer is that we don't know. The suggestive answer is that this is what preservation would look like. There's one more layer to the Carcharodons that the careful version of this argument has to handle with respect, because the fan base is rightly protective of it, and a viewer named LowJack685 spoke for 290 people when they did. The chapter is built, in its rights and its names, on a Polynesian foundation, specifically a Maori one. Their chief librarian is Te Kahurangi, called the Pale Nomad. They marked the handling of their sacred war gear with the concept of tapu, the Maori word for that which is set apart, forbidden, sacred to touch. Their iconography carries the visual language of tamoko, and their whole reverence for ancestry, the wandering ancestors, the genealogy that runs back to a day of exile, echoes whakapapa, the Maori discipline of reciting one's lineage back through the generations. I raise this not to mine it for the theory, but because it's load-bearing for the theory in an honest way. This is a culture organized at its root around remembering exactly who your ancestors were and where you came from. And it belongs to the one chapter in the Imperium whose origin the records cannot supply. A people whose entire spiritual architecture is genealogy, and who have been left, by someone, without the top line of theirs.
That is either a tragic accident of the deep void, or it is the cruelest possible thing to do to a legion you wanted to disappear. Take a people who define themselves by their ancestors, and remove the ancestor. The Codex is silent on this point, but the cold tank isn't. Which brings us to the warrior in the largest tank of all, Tyberos, the Red Wake, the Shade Lord of the Carcharodons, master of the battle barge Nicor, and company master of the First Company, the Red Brethren. A separate creator, Ordo Illuminati, built a video around the idea that Tyberos himself is a lost Primarch, and 104,000 people watched it, on a channel a fraction of this one's size, which tells you the appetite is real. I am not going to make that argument, because I don't think it holds, and I told you at the top I wouldn't sell you the romantic answer. But I want to look at what's true about Tyberos, because what's true is strange enough.
He is a giant even among giants, so far outside the size envelope of a normal space marine that the hobby press reaches for the word biggest without qualification. When his face is exposed, it is corpse white, the bone half showing through,
the eyes a depthless black with no light in them. He fights in a relic suit of Terminator armor and moves in it with a speed that armor is not supposed to allow. His weapons are a matched pair of ancient lightning claws, Hunger and Slake, of a pattern and manufacture unknown to the Adepts of Mars, and it is whispered within his own chapter that those claws once belonged to the 18th chapter of the Raven Guard Legion. There's that thread again, you'll notice. The same Raven Guard thread that the countercase rests on, surfacing in the chapter master's own hands. The record does not point one way. It points in a tangle, and the tangle is the honest finding.
Here is the careful version of the Tyberos argument, the one the evidence can actually bear. His gene character, his physiology, his archaic relics, his sheer scale, reads as old, reads as pure, reads as closer to the source than a tail-end successor chapter founded in the 23rd founding has any business being. And the Mechanicus, who catalog and test and license every fragment of Astartes biology in the Imperium, have looked at this chapter's gene seed and recorded it as prone to degeneration, prone to mutation, behaving in ways their files would rather not dwell on. The cautious reading is that this is an old, unstable, possibly chimeric gene line of uncertain parentage. The suggestive reading, the one this video is built to ask, not to prove, is that what the Mechanicus is looking at and declining to investigate is what an undiluted, unreprogrammed warrior of an erased legion would look like, 10,000 years after the line was supposed to have ended. Too archaic, Too pure, too close to the source, and carefully not examined. And here is where the canon does something genuinely strange that cuts in every direction at once, so I have to give it to you straight. In Robbie McNiven's novel Red Tithe, one of the two Carcharodons books, alongside its sequel Outer Dark, the Black Library novels that flesh out this chapter beyond the sourcebook, it is heavily implied that the space sharks don't carry one gene seed at all, but several woven together. Raven Guard, Night Lords, and World Eaters, 3 different legion lines braided into one chapter. If that's true, it blows up the clean, lost Second Legion story as much as it blows up the clean Raven Guard one, because a single erased legion wouldn't read as 3. But, and this is the part that matters, that information, in the novel, is handed to one of the Carcharodons by a demon, a creature of the warp, in the business of poisoning minds, choosing what to whisper to a man it wants to break.
Chaos does not deal in clean facts. It deals in the lie shaped most like the truth you already fear. So the multi-gene revelation is not a record, it's a temptation, narrated by the worst possible witness, and the honest reader files it as uncertain with a heavy underline. It is on the table. It is not evidence for anything. It's one more thing the record refuses to settle. But here's where it gets harder, and where the theory has to answer its single best objection. If the Imperium had a problem with the Second Legion, if the Second had turned or failed or fallen to ruin, then the edict of obliteration is the harsh, total, scorched record answer. You don't hide a traitor. You erase him, and you're done. So why, on this theory, is there anyone left to hide at all? Why would a legion marked for deletion be sitting in cold tanks at the edge of the galaxy 10,000 years later, instead of simply gone?
And the answer the theory offers is the most interesting thing about it. And it's anchored to a comment that 256 people upvoted from a viewer named Yavor Danov, who pointed out the obvious thing about the Carcharodons that the loyal legion reading turns on. Whatever else they are, they're still more loyal than the traitor legions ever were. The Carcharodons fight for the Imperium. They came to the Badab War unbidden, and they fought on the loyalist side, against the secessionists, and then they left. They are not excommunicate. They are not in rebellion. They are, by every action on record, a loyal chapter doing loyal work in the dark. So flip the question. The edict of obliteration is what you do to a legion that betrayed you.
But what do you do to a legion that didn't? That stayed loyal, that worked, that was effective at something so dangerous or so embarrassing or so impossible to admit publicly that you cannot keep it in the histories and you cannot bring yourself to be rid of it either. You don't erase it in disgrace. You retire it. You file it somewhere no one will go looking. You put it on the ceaseless crusade beyond the galaxy's edge, into the outer dark, with a sacred duty that conveniently keeps it forever away from anyone who might recognize it, and you let the records fall quiet on their own. The canon even hands you the in-universe shape of this. The Carcharodons' own oral history speaks of a day of exile, when their wandering ancestors were banished from their home world and ordered out beyond the galaxy's edge, at the command of a figure their legends call only the Forgotten One. Banished, ordered out, by someone whose name they no longer have. The Imperium did not need to destroy this legion. It needed it gone. There is a difference. An exile is the difference. And then the records go quiet, which is exactly what they do. Now we come to the part the channel has been building toward across more than one video, and I want to connect it carefully, because this is where speculation has to be labeled as speculation in big letters. There is a thread in the canon about gene stock that was smuggled out of the wreck of the heresy. After the catastrophe at Istvan, after the drop site massacre broke 3 loyal legions on the Black Sand, the Primarch Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard was pulled out of the ruin at less than 5% of his legion's strength, and the Emperor gave him something to rebuild with. The top-secret remnants of gene stock left over from the original Primarch project. That is the plot of the Horus Heresy novel Deliverance Lost. And here I have to correct the record, because the brief I'm working from credits that novel to Aaron Dembski-Bowden, and it isn't his. Deliverance Lost was written by Gav Thorpe, published by Black Library in 2012. The book is real, the gene stock thread is real, the author attribution in my notes was wrong, and on a channel whose audience corrects the pronunciation of gene seed in the comments, I'd rather fix it out loud than let it stand. Here is what that thread lets the theory reach for. We know from canon that primal Primarch project gene material existed, was secret, and was moved. We know the Raven Guard line, the same line the countercase keeps tying the Carcharodons to, was the one entrusted with it. And the question the theory poses is whether the space sharks are the vault. Not a chapter that happens to share a few Raven Guard markers, but the living archive into which the gene stock of an erased brother was poured, and then sailed to the literal edge of the galaxy, precisely so that no one in 10,000 years would think to look for it there. The outer dark not as exile for punishment, but as exile as storage. The pale giants in their coffins not as a chapter that went strange in the deep, but as a legion's worth of preserved inheritance, kept cold and kept moving and kept off every chart. And now the honest break, because I promised it and the cohort will check. Canon says, in plain words, that none of the gene seed of the 2nd and 11th Legions survived to form part of the Imperium's modern factions. At least, the canon adds, not officially. The vault reading is an assembly. It takes a real smuggled gene stock thread, a real Raven Guard connection, a real documented edict of obliteration, and a real anomalous chapter, and it proposes one line through all 4. That line is not canon, it is a reading. The 4 points are real and sourced. The line drawn through them is the channels,
and you should hold it as exactly that, a shape that stands up between the pieces, not a verdict stamped by Games Workshop. So where does that leave us, with the honest version of all of it laid out? It leaves us with a creed, and it's the one a viewer named Ristic Tutor 1 left under one of these videos, the one 76 people signed their names to, the one that is really the engine under this whole argument. The Emperor does not make mistakes in his designs. Take that seriously for a second, the way the men who built the Imperium took it seriously, and watch what it does to the lost legion question.
Because the standard story about the missing legions is a story of failure. The 2nd and the 11th, we are told, went wrong somehow, fell, or fought badly, or shamed the project. And so they were erased, the way you'd quietly delete a draft that embarrassed you. But the Emperor does not make mistakes in his designs. If you actually believe that, if the Imperium's own theology is even half true, then a legion the Emperor built was not a draft. It was not a failure to be deleted in shame. Whatever the 2nd was, it was made on purpose, by a being the setting insists does not err, to do a job. And that reframes the entire act of erasure. You do not hide your failures at the edge of the map under 10 millennia of cryosleep and a sacred crusade and a name removed from every record. You bury your failures and you move on. The thing you hide that carefully, the thing you can neither catalog nor be rid of, the thing you file at the literal end of the world, behind the most successful redaction in your history, is not a mistake. It's a success too dangerous to display. A weapon that worked too well to keep in the armory where people could see it, and worked too well to be allowed to break. So you lock the case. You sail it past the edge of every chart, and you let even the men who built it forget its name. That is the theory. Not as a ruling. The canon issues no ruling, and I won't either. As a shape. A documented chapter with a documented blank where its father should be. A documented imperial procedure for making exactly that kind of blank, used on exactly 2 legions. A culture built around coffins, in the one chapter that made the coffin its whole identity. A gene line the Mechanicus tests and then declines to investigate. A Raven Guard thread that points the other way and refuses to let the romantic answer close. And a crusade into the outer dark that conveniently keeps the whole question 10,000 light-years from anyone who might recognize the answer. Lay those on the table, and a picture stands up between them. It is not proof. It is the picture proof would make. And we are going to leave it standing on its own, without calling it canon, because it isn't. And the moment we call it canon, we've become the thing we started by warning you about. Every other chapter in the Imperium can name its father. The Carcharodons cannot. We're told that's because they've been gone too long, sailed too far, kept too quiet. But there is another reason a soldier has no recorded father. It's because someone went through the records and took the name out. The space sharks didn't lose their origin in the dark. They were sent into the dark so their origin would be lost. And if you want to know what the Imperium does with a legion, it can neither trust to the histories nor bring itself to destroy. Look at the edge of the map, where the pale giants sleep in their coffins between killings, and ask why a loyal chapter needs to be hidden at the end of the world.